Hi, this is Peter Beal again with the third lecture in the series about art history. This one covers the period from about the end or so of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, out to roughly speaking the beginning of maybe middle of the 17th century, thereabouts, of the Italian Baroque. Where we should probably begin is at the beginning of the 15th century, and the new focus that we see, especially in the northern countries, such as, well, countries, areas such as Flanders, the new interest in naturalism and the effects possible, especially with oil paint. You may remember some other paintings. You might remember, for instance, Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait. The Lambour brothers in their Tréviseurs, commissioned by the Duc de Berry, in the roughly around 1415, gives us many of the similar effects, showing in this particular instance rural laborers, farmers out at work in the fields. We can see remarkable attention paid to specific details about clothes, farming technology, usage of it, and also, interestingly, a new interest in the properties of light. We can definitely see, for instance, very clear cast shadows. And this interest in naturalism, I think, is critical for understanding the Renaissance, along with a new interest in classical antiquity, as evidenced by Donatello's David from, roughly speaking, the middle of the 15th century. The Donatello sculpture is usually known as the first freestanding nude male sculpture since antiquity, so we're talking roughly 1,000 years or so since anybody had put something like this together. And although the sculpture is of an Old Testament hero, certainly part of the Christian, standard Christian iconography, it's very clear that Donatello has adapted classical modes of presentation, especially, of course, contrapposto in representing the figure. So this new interest in the beauty of the human body and the potential for humans to live happily and improve themselves in this world, I think, is reflected not just in the writings and thought of the 15th century in Italy, but also in the visual arts. We can see a sense of this in Masaccio's grand, monumental, almost sculptural fresco figures in his tribute money from about 1427-8, where he presents Christ and his disciples as, in essence, a group of Roman, almost like Roman patricians, standing debating whether they should pay a tax to Caesar. Masaccio gives them remarkable three-dimensionality and depth, and also a certain psychological and intellectual dimension that really we do not see in Italian art prior to this period, and maybe not since the era of classical antiquity. Again, in the north, the focus on precision of application of oil paint and recreating the textures of everyday life, the appearance of light reflecting off things, is abundantly seen in artists like Jan van Eyck or even Roger van der Weyden, though here, in his Descent from the Cross, he endows his figures with a particularly intense pathos, a sort of affective feel to the painting is seen throughout. This is very influential, this particular piece, throughout Europe, and we see numerous paintings either copying it or utilizing motifs from it. One of the one of the critical things to think about with regard to art of the mid to late 15th century is the fascination with the representation of visual space, three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, and the mathematical processes that were involved in creating that illusion. Piero della Francesca, in his Flagellation, illustrates perfectly this tendency, and indeed Piero himself writes a mathematical treatise on perspective, being therefore one of the earliest, if not the earliest, artist to compose and publish such a work. In his Flagellation, everything that is you see within the visual field has this kind of mathematical exactitude, as though we could measure almost with a ruler the positions and heights and the sort of known quantities of every single figure, every single object in the painting. And this, I think, is seen as a major goal of an artist, to create a believable and plausible space in which figures can act, where grand narratives can be constructed or depicted. Such is less the case in Sandro Botticelli's poetic vision of the birth of Venus, a very famous picture from the 1480s. Venus wafting ashore on a shell really doesn't conform to that mathematical notion of space that Pier della Francesca represents, but instead is a kind of poetic and philosophical meditation, perhaps influenced by the currents of Neoplatonism typical in Florence in the later half of the 15th century, where we see the pure but nude female figure of Venus about to be covered up by an attendant, perhaps reflecting that Neoplatonist idea that we only begin to understand truth through the vehicle of beauty, but that we have to, in essence, dispense with or set aside the lure of physical attraction. Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most interesting figures of the Italian Renaissance. Born in 1452 and dying in 1519, his career spans a lot of these developments in the visual arts. He masters very quickly the concepts of perspective and anatomy, and indeed becomes a leading student of human anatomy. And he focuses on a much more subtle and refined mode of painting, one that emphasizes subtle gradations between light and dark, and explores the power of natural processes, and indeed composes thousands and thousands of pages of manuscripts that relate scientific explorations of various natural phenomena, including, for instance, the behavior of water, studies and how a force works, and things like that. The Mona Lisa, perhaps the most famous painting in the world, is a kind of distillation in many ways of a lot of Leonardo's ideas about how to represent the human figure and the human face, and also perhaps to depict the forces of nature at work, as is seen in that complex and mysterious landscape behind the figure. Raphael's approach in the School of Athens is much more, I'd have to say, expedient in a way, certainly much more synthetic and less original than either of the two other famous artists of the period, Leonardo or Michelangelo. And indeed, he pays homage to those figures, Leonardo, in the guise of Plato in the center on the left, and then just below him, the figure leaning on the block is assumed to be Michelangelo. In his School of Athens, he creates a remarkable, again, a synthesis of ideas about art and personalities of the ancient world in particular. Philosophers and scientists are gathered together in this beautiful space, probably representing plans for the new St. Peter's. Raphael creates this harmonious and rational vision, not necessarily a static and stiff one, but certainly a composed and, again, harmonious and balanced composition that ushers us into the kind of vision of classical antiquity that seems very typical of this period. A more complex and nuanced approach to this new pictorial language is seen in the Venetian artists, who focus more on the properties of color and emotion. So Giorgione's Tempest from about 1510, so roughly contemporary with Raphael, has an ambiguous subject set in a relatively untamed natural environment, and again with that dramatic lightning bolt and tempest in the background, we're ultimately left to wonder exactly what the purpose of this particular scene in fact is. The preoccupation with color and coloristic effects extended certainly to Titian's handling of the female nude, where he uses the unique properties of oil paint and canvas to create a female figure that almost brings to life the textures and warmth of the human skin, not in a sculptural sense, but in a genuine tactile sense. Again, the Venetians are very interested in the effects of color and emotion. The later 15th and 16th centuries marks the emergence of self-portraits on a much more significant scale. And we see artists doing this. For instance, Albrecht Dürer, one of the most important artists in Western art history, and certainly one of the most important artists, if not the most important artist from Germany at the time. Dürer's self-portrait clearly represents the artist as a kind of almost Jesus-like figure, shown in a very, very high status garb, and inviting the viewer to sort of reflect upon the remarkable technical ability in representing things in oil paint, but also this remarkable ability to capture the artist's intellect and even soul in this picture. In the art of China and Japan, we see a number of interesting developments, in particular in the Ming era, a kind of contest, if you will, between official court art that focuses on precision of detail, lively colors, lots of movement and action. We might see this, for instance, in the hundreds of birds admiring the peacocks, the type of art that would be typically associated with the official court of the emperor. This stands in contrast to the literati style that's typical of Shenzhou, for instance, in this album leaf entitled Poet on a Mountaintop, which emphasizes a solitary contemplative poet admiring the beauties of nature far away from the artificiality and constraints of the court, and indeed is accompanied by a short poem and beautiful calligraphy. And this is very, very typical of this sort of contrast between the two is typical of much of the art history of China from roughly the Yuan era, let's say the end of the 13th century, on into the roughly the 18th century. An interest in Asian art that's in many ways quite different from that of the West is in the garden and the natural forms of the garden that are allowed to, in essence, exist independently. In the West, the tradition in gardens is a much more controlled type of environment. But in Japan, for instance, we see gardens given a lot more, or the elements in gardens given a lot more free rein. In the pre-Columbian Americas, the Aztecs are certainly the most spectacular architects in many ways. And in the last century or so, archaeologists and art historians have gone a long way toward reconstructing the extent and sophistication of the city of Teotihuacan, for instance. If we look at Aztec art, certainly with the example of Coatlicue, you can see this use of distinctive, bold forms to represent, like the case of Coatlicue, remarkably scary, I think, in vigorous figures. Another great example of pre-Columbian architecture, city planning, is seen in the ancient city of Machu Picchu, going back into the 15th century, one of the most spectacular monuments in the world, and is a sort of mute testimony to the extent of some of these cultures, again, Aztec, Inca, and Maya, and so on. As we wrap up into the 16th and 17th centuries, the optimism and sort of vision that Raphael, for instance, promotes in the School of Athens gives way to religious controversy and even outright conflict, certainly with the arrival of the Reformation in the 1520s. The sack of Rome of 1527 may well have had that effect on Michelangelo's Last Judgment that we see around 1540, where numerous figures are depicted in states of anguish and torment. That style begins to emerge in a more full-fledged form in Mannerism, a style that emphasizes contrasts of light and shade, eccentric postures of figures, and distortions of one kind or another, as we might see in Tintoretto's Miracle of the Slave, or even more spectacularly in Bronzino's allegory with Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, where artificial figures are distributed in peculiar and eccentric ways. This begins to change with the period of the Baroque, where a new kind of expansiveness and revival of classical forms is seen, with an emphasis again on power and dynamism. Even theatricality is seen in Bernini's Piazza for St. Peter's, or on a more subtle scale with Francesco Borromini's San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, where the forms of architecture are almost bent and shaped at will. In sculpture, as in Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, or in painting with Michelangelo's Calling of St. Matthew, the sense of theatrical presentation is ever present. It really forms an important part of the Baroque style, as inherited by Rembrandt, for instance, in the middle of the 17th century with his Resurrection of Christ. A different vision is seen in terms of Annibale Carracci's classical landscape notion, with the rest on or just the flight into Egypt, where we see a beautiful and serene and ordered landscape through which the Holy Family traverses. Everything, in essence, is in balance and in harmony in nature, an idea that's borrowed by the likes of Claude Lorrain, for instance, in his pastoral scene right here, where again the notion of harmony and balance and serenity is present throughout.